In this video, we're going to correlate the wiring diagrams, such as the slot mapping diagram shown here, with the actual physical slots on the stator housing assembly. Here we have a picture of the generator with the bearing end bell housing removed, and you can see that all these jumper wires are wrapped around a large circle coated in gray epoxy to keep them from vibrating and causing issues. So we have a space limitation issue here we have to deal with. As you may recall, we have jumpers between the series of coils, and we also have jumpers which connect the one half of the stator coils to the other half of the stator coils. So we have to consider these things, and this is what you see right here sticking out. These are all the jumpers, which are quite a few, and they have to be dealt with in their physical size. This series of pictures shows how the stator housing sandwiches in between the engine end plate and the bearing end plate. And we have to have all these wires shown in this picture right here. They have to be contained within those areas, so the thickness of this grouping is very important. Here we are measuring the depth of the end cap on the engine side, and the ruler shows that it's 2.5 inches. There's a little ridge shown right here. You can barely see it, but there is a ridge, and that's where the rotor housing mates up with this end cap. It fits right inside that little ridge there. And we have 2.5 inches from the ridge back to the back. We also have the bolt head. So we'll consider 1/8 of an inch for the insert to make the housing lock into the end cap, and then another 1/4 of an inch for the head of the bolt down there at the end of the end cap, which bolts the end cap to the engine. So we end up with about 2.25 inches of clearance on the engine end cap. In this picture of the bearing housing, we notice that the parallax makes it look like 2 inches. Really, we have 1.5 inches of depth here. So we got to cut back a little bit. We can't have anything touching. So we're going to call this 1.25 inches as the maximum amount of wire we have hanging out at the bearing end cap outside of the rotor the stator housing itself. Therefore, we must ensure that the stator windings protruding at the ends of the stator housing don't exceed more than 1.25 inches beyond the edge of the stator housing. The generator end inside, we know we have like 2.5 inches, but air cooling has to come through there too. If you look at this picture right here, you'll see that the air cooling comes in through these slots, and it has to have room to get between the armature and the stator to cool the armature and the stator. So we're going to make that in 1.25 inch maximum protrusion also. As shown in this picture, we must also consider the outside diameter of this protrusion of wires extending beyond the edge of the stator housing. These wires consist of the actual windings that are jumping from one slot to the other, and also all the jumpers that connect all the windings. So these are physical issues we have to consider when we wind these coil windings. Another physical issue we have to deal with is the fact that each coil covers a different slot spacing, therefore each coil has a different diameter. For example, up here on coil I, it has to be this distance on the ends to reach between slots 10 and 15. And coil L has to have this distance on the ends to reach between slots 7 and 18. So these coils have to be wound with different diameters to fit these different slot requirements. Yet we still want the coils all in series. So we don't want to have to solder every coil to the next coil. We want to wind this continuously, wrap the first coil, do the spacing to get the jumper to go to the next slot, and then wrap the next coil. And it's going to be difficult, but that's the way it has to be done. For example, for each coil on each side of the stator, I have to put a temporary wire in slot, let's use the previous example, slot 7 and slot 18. I got to shape the wire to file around the coil and not go past the upper edge of the coil. And I have to do this for each side of each coil. And then I got to measure the width of the stator housing. And the sum of those two sides and the two widths will give me the loop circumference of each coil winding. So there you have it. These are the physical issues that have to be addressed to have a successful rewinding of this generator/alternator. Fortunately, we have removed the battery charging windings, therefore I'll have more room to deal with the protrusions at the ends and the actual number of wires in each slot. So that'll make this job a little bit easier by getting rid of those battery charged windings. So this concludes the discussion of physical considerations for rewinding this generator.